Hey, today I want to share with you 6 tips to help you get past 1200. This is the 4th video in a series. I've already talked about how to get past 600, 800, 1000. So if you are a little bit lower rated and you want to check out those first. But for everyone else, let's get started. So to prepare for this video, I looked at 100 games from players rated right around 1200, and I wrote down all the different mistakes that they were making that were causing them to lose. I'm going to show you that right now. All right, so as usual, we see blunders are at the top of the list, coming in at 37%. Now this was slightly down from the last video where I looked at 1,000 rated players, and that makes sense because as you get to the higher and higher rating levels, you would expect to see less and less big mistakes. So I want to share with you one tip that I think will help you blunder less. This is something that I started doing a long time ago, and it's really helped me eliminate a lot of blunders from my games, and it's called a blunder check. So I want to show you an example. Right now, this is actually a position from one of the games that I looked at. Both players are right around 1300, and white did a really good job, got into a really good position, and then he proceeded to play b5. And I'll go ahead and give you a second and see if you can spot why that was such a terrible move. Well, if you noticed queen to d1, congratulations, that's exactly what black played, and the game was over. Now, this was a relatively obvious mistake that could have been prevented if white had done what I call a blunder check. So a blunder check is something that you do after you've thought about the position and you're ready to make your move. So in this case, white had thought about it and he was ready to play pawn to b5. And the blunder check consists of 4 parts. So part number 1 is you look at the move you're about to make and see if it's obviously giving away a piece. So is moving this pawn here giving away some free piece? Well, no, it's not. If he takes the pawn, you're going to take with the queen. So that's fine. Step number 2 in the blunder check is you look at your opponent's last move and you see if there are any obvious threats because of that move. So in this case, black had just played queen to d6. White should have stopped and checked before making this move, is there any obvious threats from this move? And he may have saw queen to d1. Step number 3 in the blunder check is you check your king and you see if there are any checks that are going to be dangerous. So I would just kind of look here. Okay, that's a check, but I'm not worried about it. I'll just take it with my queen. That's a check, but I'm not worried about it. I'll just take it with the knight. That's a check. I'm not worried. That's a check that I should be worried about because it's checkmate, right? The rook's defending. So if he would have done that, again, there's 2 chances that he would have seen this move. And then the 4th step in the blunder check is you check your queen. By playing this move, is my queen going to be in danger? No, it's not. So had this player done that, he probably would have saw the checkmate on d1. So my advice going forward in your games, after you think about the position and you're ready to make your move, before you actually make it, just real quickly go through those 4 things. Is this move going to give away a piece? What was my opponent's last move? Is my king in danger? Is my queen in danger? And I think you'll notice a lot of blunders start to go away. All right, so the next mistake that I saw fairly often, 23% of the games, was what I'm calling couldn't defend the king. Now this mainly happened when players' kings were under attack and they really made some poor choices when it came to defending. So let me show you an example of exactly what I'm talking about. Suppose I play e4, my opponent plays e5, I play knight f3, knight c6, bring my bishop out, opponent plays d6, and I decide to castle, which is a great idea, right? I'm developing my pieces, I'm castling before move 10. But now suppose my opponent plays g5, okay? He's launching, I presume, a pawn storm to attack my king. And this is the type of thing that I saw quite a few players almost kind of start to panic a little bit, right? So as an example, let's say I play d3, and now my opponent plays g4. So this is the kind of position that a lot of players got into, and then they had a really hard time defending their king, made some bad moves, and ended up getting into a lot of trouble. So I have 4 tips that I want to give you when it comes to defending your king from pawn attacks after you castle. So tip number 1 is you can delay castling by a move or 2 to give yourself a little bit more information about what your opponent might be planning. Okay, so let me back up a couple moves here. So when I castled on move 4, I'm probably going to play maybe d3 or knight c3 anyway. I could play those moves first and just hold on a second before I castle, right? So I could have played knight c3. And now if my opponent played g5, Now I could say, oh, now hold on a second, do I still want to castle over here? It looks like my opponent is about to launch a pawn storm on my king. And I might say, you know what, maybe I'll just play d3, bishop e3, queen d2, and castle queenside instead if he continues to push these pawns. So even by waiting 1 or 2 moves, you can gain some valuable information before you decide to castle. So that's one tip to be aware of. Okay, but let's go back and say I already castled, and now the pawn storm is coming. g5, I play d3, and he continues his attack with g4. I think most players in the games that I looked at would immediately assume, okay, I've got to retreat my knight either to e1 or to d2. But a much better move in this position is actually to play knight to g5. And so that brings me to tip number 2 when dealing with an attack on your king. You don't always have to be defensive. Sometimes the best option you have is to go on the offensive and attack, right? So knight to g5 is a really strong move because we're putting some serious pressure on black. And this is something you can get better at with practice because our natural instinct is when we're attacked to kind of go on the defensive. But if you can train yourself to double check and see if there's maybe an opportunity to counterattack, it might be a better move. All right, but let's say I didn't do that. I played knight to e1 and my opponent continued with h5, clearly launching this pawn storm on my king. So tip number 3 is, generally speaking, when somebody is attacking you on the flank, so on these 2 side files, it's a good idea to counterattack in the center. Some of these 4 central files. So how can I counterattack in the center in this position? Well, d4 doesn't really make sense because I'm just giving away the pawn for free. But f4 actually looks like a pretty good move. And the idea is I'd simply like to capture on e5, and then I'm going to have a lot of pressure on this f7 pawn. And remember, black's king is still in the center. He's wasted a bunch of moves, making all these pawn moves. So I can take advantage of that by opening up the center. And if black decides to en passant, I can just take with the knight. Again, I have knight g5 coming next with a triple attack on f7, and black's attack really has already fizzled out, and white is the one with all the winning chances in just a couple of quick moves. So keep in mind that when you're being attacked on the flank, try to look for opportunities to counterattack somewhere in the center. All right, now I'm going to go back. Let's say you didn't play f4, you played bishop to e3, and black continues pushing his pawns forward. Tip number 4 when dealing with a pawn storm attack on your king is to let your opponent make the first pawn push and then try to create a blockade. So what I mean by that is, let's say I just developed my knight here. I'm letting him push his pawns forward. If he plays h3, I'm going to create a blockade. I'm going to play g3, and notice how these pawns are now stuck. None of them can move. And that's actually a really good thing for you, or me in this case, because black's pieces are now basically stuck behind his own pawns, right? His rook isn't doing anything because it's hitting his own pawn. He's not attacking the square. He's not attacking. It's blocked by the pawn. Same thing with his queen. He can't really bring his queen anywhere. Even if he tried to come here and maybe come over somewhere, like here and here, he's just going to be hitting his own pawns. He can't really get through. Now, there is a weakness on g2 I have to be careful about, but for the most part, black's attack has fizzled out, right? So let them push first, and then you push past to create a blockade. And the other option that black could have done is g3. And again, what am I going to do? I'm going to just push past, right? Create this little blockade. Now he can capture it, and I'll take it back, but I still have this pawn which is stopping his rook. It's also stopping his queen from going there. It's like black's own pieces is blockading his own pieces, which is a good thing for me. So if I go back to this position, instead of playing knight c3, if I were to do something like g3, try to push myself, I'm going to get into big trouble because after he captures, I capture. Look at how open this file is. His rook is controlling all of these squares. All he has to do is bring his queen over, and guess what's happening? I'm getting checkmated on h1 real fast, right? So you definitely do not want to open files where your king is if it can be avoided. Okay, so those are the 4 tips for defending against pawn storms on your king. Try to delay castling by a move or 2 in certain situations if you need to get more information. Remember that you don't always have to be defensive. You can look for opportunities to go on the attack. Number 3, usually flank attacks on the side should be counterattacked in the center. And number 4, try to let your opponent push first and then make a blockade so that his pawns get in his own way. All right, so next up, in 10% of the game, I saw a lot of knight forks happening on c2, c7, f2, and f7. So c2, c7, f2, and f7. You'll notice that knight here, knight here, knight here is perfectly lined up to get a nice little fork on my king and my rook. Same thing over here. The knight can very easily come here and get a fork, right? And so, for example, d4, d5, bishop f4, knight f6, knight c3. If I play the natural looking knight c6, I'm already in trouble because white simply plays knight to b5, and how am I going to deal with this fork on c7? The answer is there's no good way to deal with it. The best thing to do would be to play e5, sacrifice a pawn, make things a little bit crazy, and you know, hope for the best. But this is not a good position in just 4 moves because I wasn't paying attention to this knight fork here, right? All right, so my tip for dealing with this is as soon as you notice that one of these squares is being attacked one time, you start to plan and make sure you're prepared for a second attack. So for example, if I play knight f6 and he plays knight c3, I need to be thinking, okay, it's already attacked one time. What happens if he plays knight to b5? Am I going to get in trouble with this fork? And so maybe a move that you would play would be c6, right? You just prevent the knight from going there right away. Or another idea could be you play e6 with the idea that you're going to play bishop d6 and kind of trade off these bishops to neutralize the threat. So you have options, but you have to plan ahead. If you're just too casual about the game and you just quickly play knight c6, guess what? You're in trouble already. And the same thing can happen on the f2 and f7 pawns. Make sure you're paying attention. If you see it being attacked one time, start to plan ahead for how you're going to defend in case it gets attacked again. Okay, next on the list we have Backrank Mate with 7% of the games having this mistake. And this is something that happens on either the 1st or the 8th rank. So this is the type of position that it usually shows up in. White's position looks relatively safe. Okay, black has just moved this pawn forward, and white is probably considering, should I capture this pawn? And it kind of looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 3 defenders. It looks like I can win a pawn. So takes, 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 takes. But what happens? Well, black plays rook to e1 and the game is over. Backrank checkmate, right? My king can't go anywhere. So this actually happens more often than you would think. Castling is a good thing. Leaving these 3 pawns in front of your king is a good thing unless you get backrank mated. Then it's not a good thing. So if you get to the end of the game and you still have 3 pawns in front of your king like this, one thing that you can do is consider moving this h-pawn up 1 square, right? To create an outlet for your king in case this ever happens. The other thing you can do is just be very, very careful. Make sure you pay attention to the rooks and the queens, that they don't ever get on the back rank and checkmate you like this. All right, next on the list, also at 7%, we have endgame mistakes. And usually this had to do with pawns that became queens because the player wasn't paying enough attention. So here's an example of a position where white has a slight advantage. He's up a pawn, but if he makes the wrong choice, he's going to lose very quickly. So a lot of players in this position, I would notice, would move their rook here to try to take this pawn over here. They thought, oh, well, it's it could be a free pawn. Why not? They moved their rook. Black played this. They took it. Black played c3. And now, at this point is when white would start to think, okay, I got to stop this pawn. How do I do that? Let me take it. Black recaptures. And there's no way for white to stop that, right? You could try to bring your rook over, but it's too late. You have to give up your rook after black gets the queen. So, a 2-move plan lost the game, right? That was 2 moves that white just didn't have. Okay, he didn't have time for that. So, going back, white should have considered a move like rook here to get some pressure on that pawn, or maybe king over to bring the king over to help. Something to stop these pawns, right? Because they're much further advanced than white's pawns. So the takeaway is when you get into an endgame like this, the only thing, I won't say the only thing, but 90% of the time, the thing that matters is going to be the pawns and which ones can become pass pawns and which ones are farthest advanced. So since black's pawns are much further advanced than white's goal needs to be to figure out how to stop these pawns, right? There's no way white's going to win a race if he tries to start pushing his pawns when blacks are closer, right? So just keep that in mind if you get into an endgame. All right, and the last mistake, which came in about 5% of the time, is what I'm calling 7th rank problem. So the 7th rank is right here, or the 2nd rank if you're white, right here. And it's the rank where all the pawns start, right? And the reason this is so important is, let's just say white makes a mistake in this position, plays rook here. He allows black to trade rooks, and then black gains control of this second rank. This is really good for black because look at how many targets there are for his rook, right? You know, you can try to move one pawn, but then he's going to take the other one, and you can try to defend that, but then your rook is kind of stuck sitting back here. So it's very good for black because he's got all these targets. And also, if I were to try to move these pawns forward and then bring my king out to do something, I'm not going to be able to because the rook is pinning my king to the back rank, right? So whoever gets control of either the second rank or the seventh rank usually is going to have an advantage. So if we go back a couple moves, instead of white playing, you know, this move over here, which allowed black to do that, maybe a better move would be to trade rooks and play king f1 because you're controlling that second rank, so black can't infiltrate with his rook. And then you could consider bringing your rook here to try to come to the seventh rank, or even here and trade and go into a pawn endgame. But, you know, something that prevents black from getting control of that rank. Well, hey, I hope those 6 tips help you get past 1200. If you do make it past 1200 for the first time, go ahead and leave me a comment and let me know. I like hearing about that kind of stuff. Be on the lookout for the next video where I'm going to talk about how to get past 1400. But as always, thanks so much for watching and take care.